Imagine a once mighty army reduced to a collection of ghosts, ragged, starving, and forgotten. This was the reality for the French army of Italy in the spring of 1796, just before a name that would echo through history arrived to take command. For years, these soldiers had been stranded at the foot of the Alps, locked in a brutal, thankless stalemate against the powerful forces of Austria and Piedmont Sardinia. They were the forgotten front of the French Revolutionary Wars, a distant, inconvenient problem for a government in Paris that was itself teetering on the brink of collapse. The soldiers' condition was beyond grim. It was catastrophic. Their uniforms, once the proud blue of the Republic, were now tattered rags held together by string and hope. Many marched barefoot, their feet bleeding on the frozen mountain paths. The promised supplies from Paris mostly never arrived. Convoys were either intercepted by royalist rebels, plundered by bandits, or simply never sent in the first place due to an empty treasury. Food was a constant, gnawing obsession. Rations were often nothing more than a handful of bad bread and spoiled meat. Men resorted to foraging for chestnuts, begging from hostile locals, or even looting just to survive another day. The army was literally starving to death. Pay was a distant memory. For months, even years, these men had not seen a single coin. The government paid them in worthless paper money called assignats, which had depreciated so much that a soldier's entire monthly salary couldn't buy a loaf of bread. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a deep, soul-crushing insult. They were risking their lives for a republic that couldn't even offer them the dignity of a decent meal or a pair of shoes. How could a man fight for ideals on an empty stomach? Morale, as you can imagine, was at rock bottom. Disease ran rampant through the squalid camps. Typhus, dysentery, and scurvy claimed more lives than the enemy ever did. The army's numbers dwindled daily, not just from combat and sickness, but from mass desertion. Thousands of men simply walked away, deciding that the risk of being caught and executed was better than the certainty of starving at their post. They weren't cowards. They were desperate men pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. Those who remained were a hardened, cynical bunch, their revolutionary fervor long extinguished and replaced by a bitter struggle for survival. The army's leadership was just as broken. The generals before Napoleon were competent, but uninspired, bogged down by the impossible strategic situation and the complete lack of resources. They sent desperate pleas to Paris, reports detailing the horrific conditions, but their words fell on deaf ears. The political chaos of the Directory meant that the army of Italy was out of sight, and therefore out of mind. The commanders were powerless, watching their army disintegrate before their very eyes. They could plan brilliant maneuvers on paper, but you can't execute a flanking march with soldiers who can barely stand, let alone fight. Discipline had all but collapsed. With no pay and no food, officers had little authority. Mutinies were common. Entire battalions would refuse to march, demanding the bread and boots they were promised. One infamous incident saw 2 battalions refuse an order to advance, defiantly showing their officers their bare, bloody feet. There was a pervasive sense of abandonment. These soldiers felt betrayed by the very revolution they had sworn to defend. They were no longer a cohesive fighting force. They were a desperate mob of 30,000 men, clinging to life on a hostile frontier. They faced a formidable enemy. The Austrian and Piedmontese armies were well-fed, well-equipped, and held all the strategic high ground. They looked down from their mountain forts on the wretched French camps below, confident that this ragged army posed no real threat. To the world, the Italian front was a foregone conclusion. The French were on the verge of total collapse, a spent force waiting to be swept away. This was the army that a young 26-year-old general named Napoleon Bonaparte inherited in March of 1796. He arrived not to a disciplined force ready for conquest, but to a scene of utter despair. He saw the filth, the hunger, the hopelessness. The army's quartermaster confessed he couldn't organize a major advance because he lacked the means to even get a single battalion across the border. Any other commander might have despaired, might have sent another futile report to Paris, and waited for the inevitable end. But Napoleon was not any other commander. He saw something different. Beneath the rags and the hunger, he saw veterans. He saw men who had survived years of hardship, who were tough, resilient, and knew the brutal calculus of mountain warfare. He didn't see a broken army. He saw a coiled spring, an instrument of immense potential that was waiting desperately for a leader who could unleash it. He understood their plight, but he also understood their pride. His first address to them was not one of pity, but of promise. He acknowledged their suffering directly. "Soldiers," he declared, "you are naked and ill-fed. The government owes you much, but it can give you nothing." He didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he offered them a brutal, intoxicating bargain. He pointed east, towards the rich, fertile plains of Lombardy and Italy. "I will lead you," he promised, "into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." It was a direct, audacious appeal to their most basic needs and their deepest desires. He wasn't just talking about abstract ideals of liberty and glory. He was talking about food, boots, and wealth. He was telling these starving, unpaid men that the solution to their suffering lay just over the mountains, and he was the one who could lead them there to take it. It was a message that cut through the despair and cynicism like a bolt of lightning. For the first time in years, these soldiers felt a spark of hope. Here was a general who spoke their language, who didn't hide the ugly truth, but instead offered a path out of it. His energy was infectious, his confidence absolute. He immediately began to impose order, reorganizing supply lines, making examples of corrupt contractors, and restoring a sense of discipline, not through fear alone, but through the sheer force of his will and the credibility of his promise. He was a whirlwind of activity, and the entire army could feel the change in the air. This is the crucial, often overlooked prelude to one of the most astonishing military campaigns in history. Before the lightning victories at Montenotte, Lodi, and Arcole, there was this moment of transformation. The story of Napoleon's first Italian campaign isn't just about tactical genius. It's about leadership. It's the story of how one man's vision and unbreakable willpower took a forgotten, starving, and demoralized army and, in a matter of weeks, turned it into the unstoppable force that would stun Europe, redraw the map of Italy, and set Napoleon Bonaparte on his path to empire. The legend began here, not in a palace, but in the mud and misery of a forgotten front, with an army that had nothing left to lose, and suddenly a world to win. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into history fascinating, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the past. See you next time.